Hello, everyone. As we have global audience, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Great to have you in our SAP community YouTube stream today. Sustainability with SAP is an important topic category that we would like to bring up to the attention of the SAP community, and the webcast today is the next episode in this category. Today, we would like to talk about SAP Sustainability Control Tower updates on EU taxonomy. Our speaker is Annalie McWilliams, who is Senior Sustainability Consultant at SAP. My name is Larissa Brinkman from the SAP Global User Groups organization, and I'm your host. Before handing over to our speaker, let me share a few housekeeping rules. We kindly ask to post your questions via live chat, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. To post your question, you need to sign in with your YouTube or SAP community account. The additional materials of this session, for example, PDF, will be available under the same link in the description to the video of today's session shortly after the stream is finished. And now let's get started, and over to you, Annalie.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Larissa, and welcome everyone from my side as well. I am really excited to take you through some of the updates that we have in SAP Sustainability Control Tower, which are going to help you get through your EU taxonomy process. So let's not waste too much time because we've got some good ground to cover today, and let's go ahead and get started. So we may talk a little bit about some functionality that is also upcoming. Therefore, I do need to just show you our disclaimer very quickly, just to ensure that we are all on the same page about this. And with that, we can jump into the agenda. We have a very brief agenda, but it's really packed with a bunch of updates and valuable information. So we're going to start by setting the scene with an overview of ESG reporting regulations in Europe, and specifically, of course, the EU taxonomy, which is the focus of our discussion today. And then I will give you an update on SAP Sustainability Control Tower. So this will include, on the one hand, actually taking a live look into the solution so that I can take you through some of our newest functionality within SCT. And I will also give you an outlook on some upcoming developments that will be available very soon within Sustainability Control Tower. So with that, let's get started and let's talk about the ESG reporting regulations. Setting the scene in general, I think it's pretty clear for all of us. The reporting landscape is evolving and European companies really need to keep up. So what I want to show with this slide here is that we used to look at sustainability and finance in two different lenses, in two different perspectives. We had our accounting standards and our financial statements, and we had our sustainability frameworks and standards and sustainability disclosures. And up until now, it was fine to keep those separate. We've seen convergence in the past. We've seen companies beginning to voluntarily integrate their financial statements and their sustainability disclosures. But with the regulation under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, this is now becoming mandatory. So as we all know, we need to bring together sustainability disclosures with our financial statements, and all of this information needs to be published in the management report. This is to make the information available and more readily accessible for investors, for other capital market participants, and for stakeholders to ensure that it's all being delivered in the same place and to ensure that it becomes more comparable, more reliable, and, like I mentioned, easier to access. This is true for all of the sustainability disclosures that are coming from the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. But as I said, today we're going to place our focus on the EU taxonomy. So let's take a brief look at the EU taxonomy, at what it actually is. And for most of you, I think this is a familiar concept, so I'll just take a brief minute to reintroduce it. the EU taxonomy is a major, mandatory, and evolving mechanism for assessing sustainability and creating transparency, increasing transparency. Essentially, the EU taxonomy is a classification system which enables companies to disclose their economic activities in a way that shows how much activity can be attributed to sustainable activities. So the EU taxonomy essentially introduces a catalog of activities that can be considered environmentally sustainable, and then requires companies to very closely assess their business and understand exactly how much of their business in regards to their turnover, capital expenditures, and operational expenditures can be attributed to these environmentally sustainable activities according to the EU taxonomy. And the goal here is to provide more transparency so that it becomes easier for stakeholders, for capital market participants to really understand how much of a company's business can be considered sustainable. And to this end, we know that the EU taxonomy requirements have been expanded already quite recently, and we also expect them to continue evolving significantly in the coming years. So the EU taxonomy itself also contains provisions for updates that can be given by the EU, which means that, like I said, we expect the system to continue to evolve as we move forward. A very brief recap of what we even have with the EU taxonomy is, again, it's a catalog of activities that can be considered environmentally sustainable. And these activities are divided into environmental objectives, of which there are 6. 2 of them have been fully around and fully operational since 2021, but they've also been recently adapted. And in 2023, we also received the publication of the other 4 environmental objectives under the EU taxonomy. And we can see on the right-hand side that the EU taxonomy has a very broad coverage of sectors and activities as well. So for pretty much any company with operations in Europe, there's going to be some part of your business that will require you to take a look at it through the lens of the EU taxonomy. So even if your core activities might not be on here, even if your business might not be in something that is covered by the EU taxonomy, there's often going to be relations through CapEx or through OpEx, for example, that always will tie your business back to activities that come in through the EU taxonomy. So this is a very broad coverage. This is a very intense reporting requirement. And obviously, this also then requires a very strong process to execute it. So let's just take a quick look at the key concepts behind the execution of the EU taxonomy process before we then get into the system view and into our approach to this process as SAP with Sustainability Control Tower. So on the left-hand side, we can see what scope of analysis is required for the EU taxonomy. And then on the right-hand side, we see what actually needs to be evaluated for each activity. So basically, the level of analysis takes 3 different steps. For one, we need to understand exactly which activities apply to the company in total. And that is what we call applicability. So we're taking the activity 3.18 as a relevant activity for a vehicle or for a vehicle parts manufacturer in this case. This just generally means that this company has activities within the scope of activity 3.18. Then we go to the next step and we actually look at it even more closely. We need to consider eligibility in this case. So that means we know that we have business within this activity, and we then need to figure out exactly which part of our business actually relates to this activity. And so that means going through and understanding which products actually contribute or actually can be eligible for the activity 3.18. And this can be the manufacture of vehicle components for zero emissions vehicles within a company's car divisions and also to its specific components. So this is just an example here, but again, just to make things a little bit more tangible for you. And then we go into the alignment screening. Once we've established this link between the activity and between the product, for example, we take it one step further and we go into the alignment screening, because the EU taxonomy also has a list of criteria that an activity needs to fulfill to be considered not only eligible, but also aligned with the EU taxonomy. So that means we need to ensure that these entities that we've selected, in this case, we're talking about a product, that they fulfill the substantial contribution criteria, the do no significant harm criteria, and the minimum safeguards criteria. So in the example here, we can see that we're talking about vehicle components fulfilling CO2 emission requirements and being produced in a sustainable way. To give you a better idea of what that looks like exactly, let's turn to the right-hand side of this slide and talk about the screening criteria. So as I mentioned, we have the substantial contribution criteria. And in this case, this is really a checklist of criteria that need to be fulfilled as defined by the EU taxonomy for an activity to be considered environmentally sustainable and aligned with the EU taxonomy. So in this case, we would be ensuring that the components that we are selling, these products, are being used in zero emissions vehicles. For do no significant harm, we need to widen the view a little bit. And that means we're looking at, for example, circularity considerations. And so in this case, the production of these vehicle components would need to assess and, if feasible, implement certain circularity techniques in order for us to say, okay, we can say we are doing no significant harm to other objectives in the EU taxonomy. And then finally, for all of the activities across the board in the organization, we need to ensure that the minimum safeguards as defined by the EU taxonomy are fulfilled. And these are more general criteria, general safeguards relating, for example, to labor and consumer rights, to bribery and fair competition, human rights, etc., really ensuring that a minimum standard of these safety criteria are fulfilled by the organization. And only when an activity fulfills all of these criteria can it be considered aligned with the EU taxonomy. So those are the general concepts. And now I think we're all on the same page of how the EU taxonomy works. Now, of course, we want to turn our view to SAP Sustainability Control Tower and to how we execute the EU taxonomy within this solution. So before we get started, I just want to give a very brief overview. Some of you might not have seen SCT yet. Some of you might have not have seen it for a while. So I just want to at least put a little context around this solution. Essentially, Sustainability Control Tower is our single point of truth solution for all of your sustainability data. You can see on this slide that Sustainability Control Tower sits on our business technology platform, which means that it is perfectly positioned to interact with other SAP solutions, such as your S4 system, for example, but it's also positioned in a way that it remains flexible. So SCT can be updated very flexibly without impacting your S4 system, for example, and it also enables you to keep your core clean. Another very strong advantage of this construct with SCT on the business technology platform is that it gives us the flexibility to provide updates as necessary. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, we know that the EU taxonomy is expected to evolve in the next years, which means that we as SAP also need to be flexible and deliver the updates that you require in order to execute your EU taxonomy reporting. So we are very well positioned to do that with Sustainability Control Tower. And the great thing about Sustainability Control Tower is that as a cloud solution, when we provide these updates to the solution, all subscribers of Sustainability Control Tower immediately get these updates as they are released. So when I take you through the updates that we're going to discuss in today's session, know that these are new functionality we're providing to SCT. Like I said, there will be a brief outlook as well. And anyone who is subscribed to Sustainability Control Tower will receive access to these updates as part of your subscription. So there's no need to buy extra packages, no need to do complicated upgrades. It's just part of the release cycle. And I think that's a really strong point within the solution portfolio as well. At the top, you can see what SCT covers. So very strong metric management, data sourcing and integration, data validation and assurance. We also have, of course, calculation functionality and analysis, and period closing and reporting processes across the board of ESG reporting, so not just for EU taxonomy. Again, like I said, we're going to now place our focus on the EU taxonomy reporting scenario within Sustainability Control Tower. So let's move on to the next slide and talk about that very briefly. What you can see here is the process overview of the EU taxonomy process within SCT. And you can see that we divide this process into 3 different steps. We have manage master data. During this step, you're going to bring in your master data, so-called organizational structures from your S4 system, for example, and import financial data as well. And on the other hand, review the EU taxonomy regulations so you can begin assessing in the next step. Then we come to the step 2, which is called defining and assessing scope. And in this step, you're actually going to go through those steps of applicability, eligibility, and alignment that I introduced at the beginning of the presentation. So in the step of applicability, on the one hand, we will go through an application that enables us to manage our minimum safeguards criteria, and an application that enables us to manage our EU taxonomy activities. These are relatively new functionalities in Sustainability Control Tower, and they will be the focus of the demo today. As well as the EU taxonomy side, we also, of course, need to define the scope of financial data, which means that in this case, we're also defining GL accounts for the EU taxonomy KPIs of CapEx, OpEx, and turnover. In the next step, in eligibility, that is where we bring these 2 things together. So we bring in the master data that we've gotten in the first step. We bring in the EU taxonomy activities and perform the mapping of, for example, products to an EU taxonomy activity. That's the eligibility step. Once we've executed the eligibility step, we move to the next step for alignment screening, which is where you will go through and ensure that all of the EU taxonomy criteria of substantial contribution, do no significant harm, and minimum safeguards are met. You can then perform allocations if necessary, and then we move on to the final step of the process, which is performance insight and improvement. And in this step, we provide you with calculation templates for the EU taxonomy KPIs and a pre-packaged EU taxonomy report, which you can review and also integrate directly into your EU taxonomy reporting. So with this picture, like I said, we really want to show you the end-to-end process for EU taxonomy within the Sustainability Control Tower. And now we're going to jump over into the solution and take a look at the 2 new apps that I just mentioned, so I can give you a better idea of what they look like. So here we are in Sustainability Control Tower, and you can see that I've already opened the EU taxonomy side of the application. So I just want to take you through very briefly what you can see here. We have these 2 applications right here, update master data and import financial data, to enable you to bring in your data, for example, from your S4 system. Then we have the application manage EU taxonomy minimum safeguards and manage EU taxonomy activities and criteria, which I will go into in a moment. Here in EU taxonomy configuration, we see the data preparation steps, such as managing relationships between the master data. We see this application here called Map Organizational Structures to Activities, and this is your eligibility step. So again, mapping, for example, the product to the activity. Then we have the step perform EU taxonomy alignment screening, which is where, of course, you'll perform your taxonomy alignment screening steps. In the next step, you select the relevant accounts for CapEx, OpEx, and turnover, review the financials that come together from this data to create the denominator. In the final step, calculate the EU taxonomy KPIs and perform allocations as necessary. And then finally, we review and release the EU taxonomy KPIs for reporting. So again, just to give you an idea of the entire process within Sustainability Control Tower, But like I said, we want to place our focus on these two applications here today. To start, we're going to jump into Manage EU Taxonomy Minimum Safeguards. And you can see here that this activity is currently in process, as you can see. So we have, for this activity, we have an overview of the EU taxonomy details, and this is actually a live link to the regulation that these requirements come from. And then we have edit information here, so you can see that it was edited on May 2nd, today, by me. And finally, we bring in, under the description, the information that's coming directly from this regulation that is linked. So instead of going back into a PDF document, for example, to find this information, you've got it right here in the Manage EU Taxonomy Minimum Safeguards application. And it's not just bringing you all of this information, it's also enabling you to make it more tangible for your analysis and your organization. And in order to do so, you can add your own minimum safeguards criteria. So since the minimum safeguards are relatively broadly formulated, that means they might look a little bit different for each individual organization, which means you need to have the flexibility to create your own minimum safeguards criteria. And you can see here we have criteria for human rights, anti-corruption, taxation, and fair competition, just as an example. Let's click into this one. And again, you can see here who's edited it, who created it, and you can see a description that I have added here myself. So this is a custom description that you can provide to make this description more tangible and more applicable to your own organization. You can use this in whatever way is best for you and your process. In this step here, we decide on what type of screening we'll be performing here. So we'll be looking in this case at a yes/no screening and expect the value of yes in the screening. And finally, we also want to say when this criterion is actually valid, and we select the reporting year 2023, in this case, until infinity. So you can see here that this already provides you with a very comprehensive way to manage your minimum safeguards process. Now let's go back into the main screen and let's jump straight into the Manage EU Taxonomy Activities and Criteria app. And these two applications look fairly similar to each other. So let's go a little bit deeper here because this one has a bit more meat to it, a bit more content in it, of course. You can see here that this application contains all 241 EU taxonomy activities that have been defined as of today. And these are brought into this tool through a direct connection to a database that is provided by the EU. So you know that when you go into Sustainability Control Tower, you are getting the most current state of information being pulled in directly from this database. And so this really enables you to go through either the second or third iteration of your reporting if you're already very familiar with it, or if it's your first time reporting on the EU taxonomy. It's also a very useful tool to actually explore different activities in the EU taxonomy. So let's take a quick look at a specific activity. And again, we're sticking with this example, manufacture of automotive and mobility components. You can see here that this button is already gray, and that means that I have already added this activity to my company activities. So we're going to jump over now to the company activities and take a look at it from this perspective. You can see here, like I said, it's already been added as a company activity, and you can see it has the status evaluating applicability, which means that essentially I have just added this activity to my list, and I'm now going to go through and figure out if this is actually a valid activity for my company or not. This can be very useful, for example, in documenting things that you might need to show to your auditors as you go through your EU taxonomy exercises, because it can be very useful, of course, to understand your selection process of activities and how you got from a short or from a long list to a short list, for example. This is something you can very easily document within this application. So now let's take a look at what we need to do to make this activity operational and to get it into the process. Again, you can see we have our general information here, bringing in EU taxonomy details such as the sector, the NACE codes. These are given by the EU taxonomy, the link to the delegated act that is applicable here. And you can see in this case, since this is a new activity, it is linked to the amended regulation. Little bits clarification here. This is a new activity under the amended regulation. So that's why its delegated act is actually the amended act, just to make sure that we're being clear here. For activities that existed before, we will link to the original delegated act. And then if they have been updated, which is the case for several activities, then it will be linked here as well. So for each of these activities, we need to determine the financial relevance, which means we need to tell the Sustainability Control Tower if we're looking at something that is key to our core business. So is this an activity that we generate turnover with? Is it an activity that we have CapEx in and operational expenditures? I'm going to click everything here right now, but this is something that you can also use to really figure out your scope of this activity and define whether or not this is a core business activity for your company. Again, you see we have our edit information here. We have the custom details, which tell you the validity of this criteria. And then we go down into the exploration of the activity itself. Again, we can see here that we're bringing in this text directly from the interface to the information coming from the EU. So this is exactly the same text that you will find in the PDF documents and in the regulation that is given by the EU, but it's brought together in a much more manageable and easier to process way within this application. You can also provide your own custom description if you would like, so you can enter your own text here if you need to make it a little bit more tangible for your own organization. Once we've looked at the activity description, we also have the substantial contribution criteria here. And so you can see that we also have a list of all of the substantial contribution criteria that come together through this activity in this original description here. We also have all of the footnotes and reference points to other regulation as well. In the next step, you will be going through and making these substantial contribution criteria more tangible to your business, which means that as we did with the minimum safeguards, you will go through, you will create this substantial contribution criteria, give it a name and ID, provide a description of the substantial contribution criteria, and then also prepare the alignment screening. Here again, we're selecting the evaluation type of yes, no, because the criteria in this case is that it needs to be used for zero emissions vehicles and mobility. Like I said, you can also select other types of evaluations. You could select a maximum value, a minimum value, or a range, as well as yes and no, and then always place the expected value here. The same applies for the do no significant harm criteria. So again, we also have a do no significant harm criterion right here with our own custom description, which we've taken just from the regulation right there. We have the evaluation type and the expected value. So when we've done this, we will apply this criteria to this activity. And now we can save it. And we can now decide what we want to do with this activity. So in this case, this is an applicable activity for the business. So I'm going to press this button right here. It's going to ask me again to set the financial relevance just as a further check. So I'm going to say yes, yes, and yes, CapEx, OpEx, and turnover relevant. And we set the activity to applicable, which means then when we go back into the main screen and we remove this filter, we can see that it is now included among the applicable activities for the company. You can see here as well, there are also several that are still in the process of evaluating applicability. And if you need to remove an activity from the list or decide that it is not applicable, you can then use the button right here to select that it is not applicable. So this application really enables you to comprehensively manage your EU taxonomy activities and also begin setting up the alignment screening by already defining the criteria that you need to fulfill for substantial contribution, do no significant harm, and in the other application for minimum safeguards. All right, so now I'm going to jump back into my presentation, because now we're going to talk about some future concepts as well. So I want to highlight now the step in the process that is map EU taxonomy activities to organizational structures, also known as the eligibility process. And what we're going to enable here with the release of some new functionality that is coming up in the Sustainability Control Tower. Like I said, I will be giving you a preview of it via some screenshots that you're going to see. We are going to give you an interface that enables you to very actively and easily manage the relationship between SAP objects and EU taxonomy activities. So let's take a few minutes and go through this slide. We start at the bottom in the layer financials, and this is very simply the financial data that is related, for example, to this product in the realm of your journal entries in accounting. This is the data that we're going to use to figure out exactly how much of your turnover is related to this specific product. Then when you go into the master data of Sustainability Control Tower and of your SAP system, you're selecting SAP objects in the master data that are relevant for your analysis. So in this case, we're going to select the product. We're also going to take a look at the plant because we might need to look at it for do no significant harm evaluation. In the next step, we take it one step further and we actually leverage already existing SAP groups. So in this case, we might look at a product group, which we can already use to define specific product categories that can then be mapped to EU taxonomy activities. And this is the definition that we make here in the step called EU taxonomy assets. So this is where we're actually taking these SAP standard groups, standard objects and groupings, and giving them meaning along the EU taxonomy. So we can group them specifically and make reference to the EU taxonomy activities and environmental objectives for the product, for example. This is, again, just the product view, just the eligible scope. And then in the final step, when we want to really create the full picture, we want to look not only at the product, but everything else we need to look at for do no significant harm as well. Then we take this and we make a taxonomy object out of it. And this essentially means that we are taking the master data, so these products, these product groups that come together as EU taxonomy assets, and then linking them, for example, with the plant in which the product is produced, and with the activity and the criteria. And this creates something that we call an EU taxonomy object. And this is what will enable you then to go through and perform the alignment screening. And I want to just start with a quick look at the master data so you can understand exactly what this looks like in SCT before I give you a preview of how this putting together of the EU taxonomy objects is going to look. So when you select your master data, as you can see here, you will also be asked to choose hierarchy-based or attribute-based qualities that you can take into SCT in order to make your analysis easier as you go along the process. For product, you can see, for example, that you can select either product group, product type, or item category type. These are standard attributes that are available according to your configuration of your S4 system. So in the example that we've been going through, activity 3.18, let's stick with the product and let's stick with the product group. And what will this look like as we move forward? So again, you can see this is the same kind of interface we were looking at for the EU taxonomy activity app. And this is where it all comes together. So we are creating a new substantial contribution taxonomy object in this case. We are linking it with an activity and giving it a name. We decide on a company code and a business owner for this object. we also want to tell the system the level of alignment screening. So are we looking at the object as a whole, or do we actually need to look at each individual product group within this taxonomy object? So you can either screen the entire object, or if you have, say, 5 product groups that come together in one object that require individual screening, then you can say you want to do the screening on the asset level as well. We have similar basic data here, financial relevance, we have editing data and creation data, and validity data as well. You can see here that we also have the same technical screening criteria that we just set up in the activity app as well. So we've got the transport devices, as we saw, and the vehicles in category M2 and M3. We have the expected value, as I had already stated, and we then are able to use this to link this activity to this object. Like I said, it's not just the EU taxonomy activities that come together for the object, but we also need to add these assets. And in this case, we have added this product group right here. So this taxonomy asset, again, remembering that we are structuring this product group along already available hierarchies and structures within your SAP system. And you can add not just one, but multiple assets. So you could add product group 2, product group 3, etc. Bring it all together under this one activity as it is relevant for your business. You can also see that we actually link the financial amount that is related to this product group here as well. So you can immediately begin tying the numbers together. And then, as I mentioned, when we were going through the slide of building blocks up to the EU taxonomy object, we are also linking the EU taxonomy do no significant harm objects here as well. And in this case, we're looking at plants. The EU taxonomy do no significant harm objects also follow a very similar process to the activity app and to the substantial contribution objects as well. So again, you will be determining company code, business owner, and reporting period, financial relevance, editing information, and also linking the criteria that you have already set up within your system. Just to give you a quick recap for those of you who have maybe not yet seen the, or who haven't, excuse me, for those of you who have, sorry, got some technical issues here with my slide. So we'll just move to this one right now, but this is the process view that we can see within EU taxonomy as it is right now. And the main important part of this slide is actually the one that you can see here, which means that we are doing this mapping that I was just showing you manually at this moment. So that means that we perform the same mapping exercises within this table view here. So we are still mapping product groups to activities or asset groups to activities. It's all the same that we're doing in this other kind of user interface as well. But what this really enables you to do is it makes the whole thing a lot more tangible, a lot more easy to deal with, and then it also sets you up to properly execute your alignment screening as you go forward in your process. So in the end, you really have not just, this documentation and this, formal linking of the activity and the products as we're seeing here, for example, but it's really a comprehensive method to guide you through the process of setting up your EU taxonomy objects and setting you up for success in your EU taxonomy screening. And that really takes us to the end. So I just want to summarize what SCT does for you, not just in the context of EU taxonomy, but also in the general ESG reporting context. EU taxonomy and SCT in general follows the 3 pillars: record, report, and act. We want to enable you to go from averages to actuals, in this case with SCT, directly connecting to S4 systems. We want to enable you to report as required by the EU taxonomy for your EU taxonomy KPIs. And also with the insights that you can gain from your EU taxonomy analysis, we want to enable you to act and really embed sustainability into your business DNA and drive transformation within your business. Sustainability Control Tower can be used today to help you to enable your compliant ESG reporting, gain transparency and insights on ESG. It can help you improve your performance as you set and achieve ESG targets. It ensures assurance and auditability of ESG data, and then can also help you further engage with the ESG ecosystem as your data becomes more accurate and more reliable and can then be provided to further stakeholders. So that is the end of my presentation for now. And I thank you very much for listening and for giving me your time. And now I will pass back over to Larissa to moderate the end of the session and any questions that you might have.
All right. Thank you very much, Annalie. It was great presentation, very comprehensive with a lot of insights, also with the demo. And let me check the chat, and there is 2 questions arrived. The first one is, what kind of physical units are reported in this product? And the follow-up question is, only CO2 emissions or also other greenhouse gases?
So we need to look at it actually in 2 different ways. You're talking more about typical ESG reporting that you would find under GRI or under the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which are also part of the CSRD. In this case, we're talking about EU taxonomy, and EU taxonomy actually reports financial values. So like I said at the beginning of the presentation, we are talking here about the proportion of your business, of your turnover, for example, that can be considered sustainable by the EU taxonomy. That being said, Sustainability Control Tower also has a lot of other functionality in the ESG reporting space, which we're not focusing on in this demo, in this presentation today, but it does also have the capability to report CO2 equivalents and bring in information on other emissions and other gases as well. So to give you a very short answer.
Right, thank you for that. I hope this answered the question. And we allow participants to few more minutes to add their questions in the chat. And I can bring up the question that arrived actually earlier and was brought up to me through the user groups. And this question is, how does SAP handle updates to the EU taxonomy content, as it seems to be very dynamic?
Yes. So again, we touched on this briefly, but I'm always happy to repeat it as well, because I really feel like this is a strong use case for Sustainability Control Tower. We have a team of experts on our team at SAP who's always keeping their eye on the regulation and ensuring that we are up to date whenever updates come in. And that means we're not just looking at EU taxonomy, we're not just looking at CSRD, we're also keeping our eyes on other regulations as well. And so we have a very structured process to manage these updates as they come in, to ensure that we are following the accurate methodology as required, for example, by the EU, implementing it correctly in our process, and also considering any content updates that come through. And like I mentioned, we have regular release cycles within Sustainability Control Tower, which means that you will then benefit from any updates that are made to the tool as they come in.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. Then probably one more question that is also brought up very often is, how can I prepare for my first EU taxonomy reporting process?
Yeah.
What should I do?
That can be a very long answer, but I will try to keep myself very brief. So one of the biggest issues that we see actually in context of sustainability reporting is that you need to take a look at your master data. So what I would recommend in this case is, if you know that you're going to be required to report on EU taxonomy, get clarity on which activities are applicable and eligible for your business, and then just go through an example. So if you select an activity like our activity 3.18, you go through and figure out exactly which products belong to this activity. Also need to figure out if there's CapEx involved. So if there's production equipment, for example, involved with this activity, and then really drill down to the master data level of this activity and of these related SAP objects so that you can understand if the master data level that you have at the moment is at the right granularity. Because when it comes to that kind of setup, the best time to start is, of course, now. It's before you might become obligated to report, because that gives you time to actually work through the setup and make any changes that you need. So if I could give a piece of advice to anyone who's looking at coming under EU taxonomy starting next year with CSRD, then it would be go through the exercise, at least, through for yourself with a trusted advisor, really understand the implications to your master data, because that is where you can leverage the most power and efficiency for your implementation as you move forward.
Right, thank you for that. I currently can't see more questions in the chat. As I've already indicated, the PDF of the session will be included to the description to this video as PDF for download. So you will be also able to have the materials. And yeah, for whatever questions or follow-ups, please contact Annalie. As indicated in PDF, she also shared her contact information there. With this, I thank you, Annalie, for this presentation and demo. And also, I thank you all our participants for being with us. Stay tuned. We will be offering more sessions also with a specific focus on sustainability topics. And we hope to welcome you in one of our upcoming sessions. With this, thank you very much and bye-bye.
Thank you.